examines, people would say, I don't quite understand what this book's about, because they don't give us a political blueprint that any political party could implement for them. So the idea that someone was going to hand you something was usually at the back of reviewers' minds. Well, that was what we were trying to undercut, that idea that you can be handed something. We wanted to get to the root of socialism, which is anarchism, and illustrate that through working class experience. We had myself and quite a few others, writers as well as workers, were becoming increasingly bitter about the hype which was flowing over us about Culture City 1990. It was getting to a stage where it was becoming obvious that this was going to be a celebration simply of corporate wealth in the city centre in order to make the centre of a city attractive to tourists, middle-class tourists. And that it became obvious that the slogan, Glasgow's miles better, might be true for some, but certainly not for the proles who were exiled in their various ghettos, Drumchapel, Postle Park, etc. What Culture City was all about was when people came to the city, to have this corporate wealth on display. Luxury flats, bistros where a cup of coffee can cost £2, expensive theatres. In other words, the trappings of wealth in the city, and to forget the very real poverty that's in the ghettos on the outskirts. Now, in order to create this ghetto of wealth, or ghetto of greed in the centre, you have to neglect, or you have to deprive the ghettos of poverty even further. And we decided, a group of us, to attempt to give working class experience the limelight somewhere. And this was the idea behind the book. Having the press has been a tremendous boost, both from the creative side and from the propagandistic side, because a lot of great stuff has come out. Through reading, I came to the philosophy of anarchism, the social philosophy. Anarchism as a social philosophy. This helped me to transcend the situation I was in. But when I worked in industry, I wasn't able, not having any knowledge of anarchism, not knowing that such people existed. I knew that political parties existed. I knew that Labour and Tory and SNP existed. I knew that the Communist Party existed. But not having any inclination towards these parties, I had no way of transcending the situation I was in as a worker. But later on, as an unemployed person, I was able to transcend my situation through my reading. I learned from artists as well as from propagandists. I learned from writers as diverse as Havelock Ellis and and John Steinbeck and novelists and sociologists, poets like Shelley, Herbert Reed. These were creative people who put something in to the situation which they had transcended and made it easier for other people to transcend it, to come out of that. I've always had difficulty with educators and with education, being, I suppose, a natural autodidact. But I've also believed that perhaps without the dominie, without the educator, things would be a lot better. That's open to question, of course, but it's my belief. Here we go anyway with slab. A pestle, braying, triturating, pounding, making hard things soft. That's me, the dominie. A hot pot you are to my spoon, and who ever heard of a hot pot steering a spoon? Or, after a formula you recognize, I rule. Okay? Think of me as a pastry chef, and of yourselves as the little blackbirds I bake in a pie. A selfless, thankless task, I do assure you. For of pie I take only a minute portion. No, the pies I bake the state eats, and eats nothing but, I fear. Oft times I think, if it weren't for me, the dominie, the state might easily die.
And the last fight, let us face the internationale, unite the human race, no savior from Almighty.
So there is a misconception here. There's a distortion of history which was caused by the formation of the Communist Party. It became the orthodoxy, it became the central core, and people forget that that is not so. It is an aberration. It is something which happened quite out of line and out of context with all political thinking of the left before that. The people were all the radical tradition. Very few of them believed that we'd find socialism through Parliament. Only those who became members of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party was not socialist. The Labour Party was a political wing of the trade unions. It had to adapt itself to a form of socialism in 1918 in order to capitalise on the decline of the Liberal Party and become the opposition to government. It was a manoeuvre that it called itself socialist. It wasn't socialist to begin with. In fact, in 1912 there was a great deal of argument inside the Labour Party as whether or not it should not become an industrial organisation, an industrial union. Quite a lot of argument about that. It took me some time to develop that, though. It was a form then of another socialist party. However, as I say, this generation and generations before, and intellectuals in general, think that the Communist Party was communism. They don't seem to know that before that there was a whole host of groups which were anti-parliamentary and were all based on liberal principles, not on the authoritarian principles or on democratic centralism as put forward by the Communist Party. Come Dungeons Dark is a story of Guy Aldred, who was a very well-known figure in Glasgow for about 30 years. He started his public life in England as a boy preacher at the end of 16. In the first section of the book, which is called The Herald of Revolt, shows how Guy Aldred becomes, from his Christianity, becomes a free thinker, and then he enters the political field, and after being a member of the Social Democratic Federation and going through certain evolutionary thought, becomes an anarchist, and then from that he departs from his anarchist, he becomes an anti-parliamentarian. This brings us up to the second part of the book, which is called The Steel-Bound Coffin. This relates the story of the conscience objectors during the First World War. Here, the screen widens because you cannot be biographical on such a wide theme on which so many people have taken part, about 6,000, and you cannot focus it on one person, so he was a hero. So therefore the second section of the book becomes mostly the story of the persecution of conscience objectors during the First World War, of those who were sentenced to death, of those who committed suicide, of those who revolted against the system and suffered terrible treatment in the underground cells and the dungeons of the prisons. The third section of the book deals with already been released from prison and finding himself in an entirely new world politically, because the Russian Revolution has shattered all the concepts of the old communist anarchist movements. And there begins new concepts. There is built up a theology of socialism, a theology arising from Marx, spreading into Lenin and Trotsky as the church fathers, and a churchification is built up. Against this, Guy Aldred fights, for he wants the free spirit, the free communism of the old days. And when the Communist Party, under the advice of Lenin, decides on a strategy of what they call revolutionary parliamentarism, Guy objects to this. And he is one of the main figures in the formation of the Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation. I became acquainted with Guy Aldred and his organisation somewhere around the 1930s. At that time I was in a state of mental and spiritual turmoil. I was trying to get in contact with this world and discover what it was all about. I'd attended religious meetings, I'd read many books, I was just trying to puzzle it all out. And one day I saw the May Day procession go along Trongate, and a young friend of mine who was in it, and I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to hear Guy Aldred." And so I followed him. We went to the Glasgow Green, and there, standing in the corn lorry, was Guy Aldred holding forth in the great spate. And somehow I knew at once that this is what I wanted. This was not only an answer to the material problems which I was suffering, low wages, unemployment and other things. There was a spiritual content in this. As I've said in my book, every word Guy said seemed to have at the back of it, as a coating or a matrix, man does not live by bread alone. And I felt that, and so I associated with him, and when the war broke out, I was going to oppose the war in the ship. I was working in the ships. The ship was going to carry troops. I would not join it, so I went in with Guy Aldred. When Guy was in his last illness, it was with very great reluctance that he stopped speaking. He wanted to get to the meetings, and he insisted, tried to get to the meetings, but Jenny Patrick and I wouldn't let him. So he delivered his last 3 lectures from a sick bed. Some of them are fairly lucid, but in the main the tapes were not good. The recordings were not good. So in this extract I've got here, I let him start speaking, and then I take up the theme, taking excerpts from what he said, but not the whole lecture, and then I let him say the final words in this lecture on this occasion, which were his final words to his public, his last recorded words.
The subject is vision and reality.
The subject is vision and reality. Let me begin by defining the word vision as I understand it. It comes from the Latin root and means I see. The Greek derivation also means I see, but it really means seeing with the mind, and it really means an action of the mind, and in English is expressed by the word idea rather than by the word vision. Nevertheless, the word means intellectual understanding, which is subjective, as distinct from objective reality. Reality relates not to subjective understanding, but to objective observation. It simply means things as they are, which is dull and factual. Vision means sailing on uncharted seas. It represents the mind setting out from a base of reality, venturing forth, and as a result, creating new realities. News from Spain was quite a sensation because it had a whole lot of reports from Spain directly from Ethel MacDonald and from Jenny Patrick. And the Commune is, of course, it's a reprint of much of William Morris's ideas in this one here, in the Commune. The Barcelona Bulletin is a very special thing because Ethel MacDonald got that through the customs, through the censor in Spain, because she was friendly with the censor. He was a Dutch young man, and he let it through, but in the end he got put in jail, and so did she. But that there was the first report of a clash between anarchists and the communists in Spain in 1938, was it? 37. So you see, there are quite a number of things here. The Spur was a very popular pamphlet, very popular paper, and it's quoted a great deal, and it's quite a treasure. But what we don't have here in great numbers is No Trader's Gate. We should have some of that there as well, but it seems that we don't have it. And this is a word as well. It's commemorating the death of Ethel MacDonald in that one. And here's Glasgow Green, the workers' banner. We've had that banner made in 1939 when conscription was first inaugurated, and there I am. That's my face there. There's Jenny Patrick, there's Guy Aldred, there's Mrs. Haining, and there's Ethel MacDonald. A whole crowd of us are there in those days. They bring back much memories to me, but they're fully 50 years ago now. That's a guy on his deathbed, a guy again saying hello to somebody, a guy listening quizzically to somebody, and there's Guy Aldred in his office amongst the chaos of papers which always surrounded him. He's looking up and smiling at the photographer. It was taken in 1956. So there we are, that's that collection of things. Now let me see what we've got at this side. What war means, the word quarterly. This has a story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in it, and many pictures of the horrors of the war, as you'll see here. Of course, the next war will not have any such pictures as this because there will be nobody there to take them, and in any case the victims will be disintegrated and they'll not be there. But look at these terrible pictures. Look at that. Here they are. It didn't make any difference. People went to war just the same. You always get people to do anything which authority tells them and which imitation endorses. If it's the thing to do it, the passion to do it, and it's blessed by authority, you'll get them to do anything under the sun. There was a man once exemplified this. He was back from Spain, and he lamented the docile attitude of the people in Spain. He said, you know, they put up a notice saying that all citizens have to queue up tomorrow morning to 10 strokes with a cat of 9 tails. You wouldn't be able to find your way to the through the streets for people getting the queuing up. And they will be quarrelling with each other, saying, I'm before you. Such is a cynical view of the attitude of people when you try to preach emancipation to them. But eventually that will be overcome. If we are dismayed at the prospects for mankind that the world will be destroyed, I remember once at Guy's meeting, and he repeated at other meetings when the same question came up, when he was asked, why propagate your socialism? Eventually the sun will burn up the earth and mankind will have no future. Guy said, we do not live in the abstractions of future. We live here and now. This is our expression. He says, there's no time in eternity. Eternity is a depth of feeling of life which we have within ourselves, and we can only live here and now. Let the dead past bury its dead, and let those who have a future to worry about it. And he said that reminded him, this is my final story, that reminded him of a tale told by Professor Huxley at one of his meetings. An old lady came up to him and said, "Oh, Professor, did you say this world would fall into the sun in 10,000 years or in 100,000 years?" He said 100,000 years. And he says, "Oh, I'm so glad. I thought he said 10,000 years." He says, "It's not our concern. We are what we are and develop as we are. And if mankind destroys the world, that is something in the future. We live in the here and the now and must develop ourselves in our full potential as we are at present, not as we envisage our progenitors will be, whatever what you call them." Well, anyway, you know what I mean. So there are.
When I went to the University of Stirling and suggested doing a PhD on the history of the Scottish working class from 1865 to 1900, that proposal was regarded as being very radical, because even then, in 1968, there was still a strong tendency in history departments to encourage people to look at a very narrow chronological period, whether it was Scottish history or Russian history or American history or anything else. And you were expected to know how many times people sneezed, many times they used their hanky. And I had no intention of using that approach. And I had been taught, remember, by Edwin Muir at New Battle Abbey College, 1952-53. And he had a very quiet, unaggressive sense of humour. And I remember him telling us on one occasion about the friend he had during the period of the Red Clyde, who described the Labour leader, the typical Labour leader, as a person who looks at every side of the problem without attempting to look at the problem. And I had no intention of being that kind of academic historian. I intended to try and portray the lives of ordinary Scottish working people. One thing that I did attempt to deal with in the rising of the Scottish working class was the cultural dimension. And what's implicit in that book from beginning to end is my particular socialist rejection of economism in all all its diversity. And I think that Scotland has suffered from too many Stalinists and too many left-wing historians. Not that we've had that many who've been under Stalinist influences. And they tend to sort of argue that everything can be explained in terms of the economic factor. Now, despite the fact that I'm still some sort of Marxist, I've never believed that people are only motivated by economic or materialistic considerations. So in that book there was a quite implicit, sometimes explicit, attack on Stalinistic economism. One of the other things in that book, although I was only half aware of it myself at the moment, was the focus on the importance of what I have called the cultural sediments of the past. I'm working on a biography of John McLean, and it's a book that has been in the making for a long time. My dad, who was not an educated man in the orthodox sense of that term, would tell me about the men who went to jail for the workers. And his great heroes were A.J. Cook and, above all, John McLean. And I mentioned this in Making Trouble. My dad would say, my dad couldn't believe it, he actually went to jail for us. You know, this was an educated man, my father said, he went to jail for the workers. And so I knew about John McLean from my childhood. And of course I have spoken to other people in recent years, like Eddie Boyd, who will tell you that he was part of the folklore in the west of Scotland. Not just the west of Scotland, but also here, which is really the east. He was part of the sort of Scottish working class folklore well into the 1950s. So my interest was there. It was only, I think it was only a year and a half ago I decided I wanted to do, I now wanted to do a biography of McLean. And the question is why a year and a half ago, and I think it's because McLean is still relevant to a lot of the dilemmas facing socialists in the late 20th century. I think that he was an outstanding socialist educationalist, and I think that his work as an educationalist, which is not, by the way, unproblematic, eliminates a lot of the problems that face us today, those of us who want real socialism. But he's also important for the Scottish national question and where Scotland is at today. Scotland at the crossroads. But when I was doing research in Dublin recently, in the National Library of Ireland, one of the things I discovered was that there was a fourth international set up in the early 1920s, and that John McLean, Sylvia Pankhurst and Jim Larkin, Pete Larkin and Larkin's sister were all leading members of it. Now, why did they set up this fourth international? You know, when people who know something about the history of the international left speak about the fourth international, they think about the fourth international that Trotsky set up in 1938. But this was, you know, and obviously Trotsky didn't know about this even more obscure fourth international at the end of the Second War. But why was it set up? Well, I discovered in looking at some of the Irish socialist papers in Dublin that it was partly because of the dispute about the national question in relation to both Scotland and Ireland, but more generally in the sort of shared thing that united all the people who bought in the Fourth International was their disgust with Leninist morals in inverted commas, and what they called their centralising tendencies. You see, you must remember that McLean and Larkin came from a fighting class struggle tradition, and they weren't going to be bossed around. I mean, great as their admiration for Lenin was, they weren't going to be bossed around by people in Moscow who didn't understand local conditions. He refused to be part of some small conspiracy, because always he wanted to reach out to the masses, always he wanted to activate people. And unlike a lot of the authoritarian socialists who developed from the mid-20s onwards, McLean had this passionate belief in the socialist potential of ordinary people. He wrote an open letter to Eugene Victor Debs, the American socialist, in 1919, in which he said that Debs's very imprisonment might be the thing that would activate the American working class. And he also said in private letters that his own imprisonment would probably make him just as useful to the Scottish working class than if he had been at liberty. He was prepared to sort of sacrifice if it meant going to jail, because he thought that that would expose the nature and hypocrisy of the capitalist system. He suffered terribly. I've got access to John McLean's so-called medical file. I say so-called because there are lots of things in that medical file that are not medical, things that are political. And I had to sign the Official Secrets Act to get access to it. What comes out of this whole colossal city file is the monumental inhumanity of the authorities. Maybe I'm naive, but I had imagined that the judiciary would have been more independent than it appears to have been. Because one of the things that comes out of this file as well is that before McLean was brought to trial in 1918, I mean, this was his really great trial in terms of its world historical significance. The pressure from that trial seems to have come from the army rather than from the judiciary, and I find that rather frightening. We are living through a revolutionary era, not an era of revolutionary socialism, but a revolutionary era of major capitalist restructuring. That destroys communities, or it attempts to destroy communities. It causes massive upheaval, and inevitably there is some kind of human response to this. I'm less optimistic than I was a couple of years ago, because I can see more state repression all over the world than I have seen for some time. I think that capitalism, even in this small part of the world, is more dehumanized than it was, in the 30s, 40s, or 50s. And it's got to be acknowledged, because you've got to acknowledge problems before you can start to solve them. As I've told some of my socialist friends, when you're feeling ill and you go to a doctor, you don't, if you're sensible, in the first place go for medicine, you go for a diagnosis. And I think socialists have got the job of providing the diagnosis of what's wrong with society. But if they just look at the economic aspects, they're going to miss things out. And if they miss out the cultural, if they miss out what's wrong with Scottish society or European society, socially and culturally, then they're not going to be able to provide a really inspiring alternative socialist vision of what a socialist society could be like.
I was naturally always interested in the period of the First World War and of the heroes of that period, principally McLean, because it had always seemed to me, and again, as with Gramsci, I almost thought of this, as you might say, poetically, without having a definite intellectual basis to sort of argue it on, that McLean had a key to a Scottish working class future, the way that the others didn't have, in that he seemed to understand something about the national question, and the fact that Scotland's history would still work itself out, not in the context as the Labour Party seemed to think, and even the Communist Party at that time seemed to think, in the irrecoverable sort of aftermath of the Union, but that it would still have its history in connection with an older Scotland, and McLean seemed to symbolise that to me. Well, the School of Scottish Studies as an idea, I think you could trace back a long time before its formal founding, which was in 1951. I think it was really an offshoot of the so-called Scottish Renaissance. Various academics in this university and other places felt that more attention should be given to Scottish culture, stroke folk culture, and that not enough was being given. Now, this means that Hugh McDermott, key spider in the web, as you might say, can also be regarded as being a crucial figure in this. Although later on, of course, like all good revolutionary deities, he started eating his children, or trying to. But in point of fact, McDermott, who threw out so many ideas at so many times, I think you could probably go back to early numbers of The Voice of Scotland and magazines like that, in which he is reproaching academics in this university and other universities for not paying enough attention to Scottish culture. The actual formal date of the founding of the school was 1951. I had come back personally from Italy not so long before, where I had been translating Gramsci. It seemed to me immediately that Gramsci was something else, that this was the sort of thought that could well, it needed to be translated. People should get to know about what this Italian Marxist was thinking. Up to a point, I have to admit it, I began thinking this almost before I'd read the works, you know, partly because, just as this bloke said, un grande pensatore, the idea of Gramsci being a great thinker had sort of come ahead of my actually getting acquainted with his works. But when I began reading as they came out, you know, the book about Machiavelli that eventually became thought of as the Modern Prince, for example, the Risorgimento, what he wrote about Italian 19th century history, what he wrote about the history of Italian intellectuals, but above all, of course, what he wrote about folklore and folk song. Because this seemed to me, naturally, to me, about some of the most interesting things that he had written. My own hope was that our work here in the school, that the recovery of folk culture, which, as Tom Crawford says, in many ways, folk song is the most national part of Scottish heritage. I visualised the recovery of this as being a concrete political act, which in fact it has been, you know. This was by no means liked by a number, no names, no patrial, of some of the folk that were associated with the school. And so people who were, you know, professors in the university, or people in the BBC, because there, of course, the BBC had a monopoly of airwaves. And they were effectively able to put put down a portcullis, or whatever you want to say, between the recovery of the song, which went on, you know, hand over fist in the early 50s, and its communication. Well, this is one of Jeannie Robertson's great ballads, one of my own personal favourites. It's the archetypal ballad of the bold poacher, although it goes back right to the Middle Ages, probably, and it's got various echoes in it of supernatural magic. It's Johnny of Riddesleigh, alias Johnny Cock.
Here is one May morning, cold water to wash his hand, roaring brand to me, my two greyhounds that are bound and iron bands that are bound and iron bands is all white she wrung her hands to the green woods Danny gang for the sake.
I've been interested from childhood in pipe music, and always liked, I mean, from the ethnic point of view, I'm a pure backwoodsman, as you might say. Although I've always, you know, tried to be interested in anything in music, classical or you name it. The things that I really liked listening to are Pibroch and things like that. So, what I would put on in order to have enjoyment, you know. Or even Gaelic psalm singing and things like that. Anyway, the Freedom Comoli itself is to a tune called The Bloody Fields of Flanders. Now, this Bloody Fields of Flanders is itself based upon an earlier folk tune, which Jeannie Robertson sang as Busk, Busk, Bonnie Lassie. You probably have heard it. For it's Busk, Busk, Bonnie Lassie, and come awa wi me, and I'll tak ye to Glen Isla, near bonny Glen Shee. Rock the wind in the clear day's dawn, blaws the clouds, Heelster Gowdy o'er the bay. But there's mair nor a roch wind blowing through the great glen o' the world a day. It's a thought that would gar rottens o' they rogues that gang gallus fresh and gay. Tak the road and seek their lonens for their ill ploys to sport and play. Nay, mair will the bonny callants merch to war when our braggarts cruisely craw, nor we wains fae Pithead and Clachan mourn the ships sailing down the Brummie Law. Broken families in lands we've harried will curse Scotland the brave, nae mair, nae mair. Black and white into leather married, mak the vile barracks o' their maisters bare. So come all ye at hame wi' freedom, never heed what the hoodies croak for doom. In your house, all the bairns o' Adam can find breed, Ballybrie and painted room. When McLean meets with friends in Springburn, all the roses and geens will turn to bloom, and a black boy frae yont Nyanga dings the fell gallows of the burghers doon.
So the fight's there, I think, to rid the people of the social sterility that they're in at the present, to make them creative socially, so that they can see ways out of the impasse that they're in at the present. They'll find ways. They have in the past. That will be the fight for cultural integrity in the working class.